The gavel hit the mahogany table with a crack that sounded like a gunshot, but I didn't flinch. I just leaned back in the plastic clubhouse chair, crossing my grease-stained work boots over the pristine carpet, and watched the high-definition projector flicker to life behind Anne Sterling's head. "William, this is an intervention, not a debate," Anne said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and triumph. She adjusted her pearls, looking down at me through the sharp lenses of her designer glasses. "We have 20 documented violations of the community aesthetic. We have police reports of suspicious gatherings of industrial vehicles. And as of 4 o'clock this afternoon, the board has moved to place a lien on your parents' property. You are being evicted, William. This neighborhood is simply not a place for people like you." She lingered on the last word, letting it hang in the air like a bad smell. To the 50 neighbors gathered in the room, I was Billy the mechanic, the guy in the faded high-vis vest and the beat-up '98 Land Cruiser, who was single-handedly dragging down their property values. I was the diagnosis that Anne had been trying to cure since the day I moved back home. "It's just Billy, Anne," I said, my voice dropping into that flat, dangerous calm I hadn't used since the Bitcoin crash of 17. "And before you sign that order, you might want to look at the screen." The projector displayed a single legal document, a deed of trust. At the bottom, in the section reserved for the primary creditor, sat the name of a shell company Anne didn't recognize, Diagnosis Holdings, LLC. "What is this nonsense?" Anne snapped, though I noticed her knuckles were turning white as she gripped her clipboard. "That," I said, standing up and wiping a smudge of engine oil off my thumb, "is the mortgage for this clubhouse, and the one for the community pool, and the bridge loan your husband took out to keep his law firm afloat last month. I bought the debt this morning, Anne. All of it." The silence that followed was so absolute you could hear the hum of the air conditioner. Anne's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The unemployed tradesman they had spent months trying to drive out of the neighborhood was no longer a nuisance. I was their landlord. "Now," I said, stepping toward the head table as the neighbors began to whisper in a frantic rising tide of panic. "I think it's time we talk about where the $40,000 for the beautification mulch actually went. But first, let's get one thing straight. My name isn't a diagnosis. It's the signature on your foreclosure notice. I hadn't set out to own a cul-de-sac. I just wanted to fix my dad's truck in peace. But Anne Sterling had wanted a war, and she was about to find out exactly what happens when you pick a fight with a man who has $30 million in cold storage and nothing but time on his hands. To understand how a grease monkey with a wrench ended up holding the keys to the kingdom, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to the day a blue linen suit stepped onto my driveway and made the most expensive mistake of her life. Today's story is from Billy Anderson, a man who spent his 20s navigating the high-stakes volatility of the early Bitcoin markets, accumulating a $30 million fortune before he was old enough to rent a car. Despite his immense wealth, he chooses to live in grease-stained cargos and faded flannels, a lifestyle rooted in a childhood spent watching his schoolteacher parents find dignity in hard, honest labor. Billy maintains this invisibility not out of stinginess, but as a tactical defense mechanism. He believes that by appearing as an ordinary tradesman, he can protect his peace and ensure that the people he lets into his life value his character rather than his cold storage balance. Before we dive in, if you like stories like this, smash that like button now. Comment below on where you're listening from and what you would have done if you were in Billy's situation. Would you have immediately told Anne who you were and how you could buy half the neighborhood? Or would you have hidden your wealth and continued staying under the radar? Do you think Billy did the right thing in the way he approached Anne and her HOA? Leave your thoughts below. But now let's hear Billy's story as told in his own words. "I was elbows deep in the Land Cruiser's guts, the familiar scent of old oil and sun-baked rubber acting as a strange sort of therapy. The engine bay of the '98 Toyota was a cavernous, honest place where problems could be solved with a socket set and a bit of leverage. It was a far cry from the abstract world I'd inhabited for a decade, a world of derivative swaps, candle charts, and the silent digital scream of a Bitcoin bull run. The sun was beating down on my parents' driveway, reflecting off the oily sheen on my forearms. I liked the heat. It felt heavy and real. My parents had lived in this house for 40 years, two school teachers who believed in the quiet dignity of a well-kept lawn and a paid-off mortgage. They hadn't known their son was a multimillionaire. I'd told them I did data entry for a tech firm. It saved them the stress of worrying about the volatility of my world, and it saved me from having to explain why I didn't own a yacht. I heard the heels before I saw her. It was a sharp, predatory sound on the asphalt, the rhythmic clicking of someone who walked with the intent to find fault. I didn't look up immediately. I tightened the bolt on the alternator bracket, letting the tension click in my wrist before wiping my hands on a rag that was more grease than cotton. I stood up, squinting against the glare of the white-painted cul-de-sac. Anne Sterling looked like she'd been born in a country club and vinegared in a vat of pure condescension. She was wearing a crisp, linen suit the color of a summer sky, tailored so tightly it looked like it might shatter if she took a deep breath. She held a clipboard against her chest like a shield of office. Her eyes swept over me, then the truck, then the small pile of tools on the pavement, and finally settled on my face with a look of profound physical pain. "Can I help you?" I asked. I offered a genuine, if tired, smile. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for a replacement belt. "I am Anne Sterling, president of the Oak Creek Estates Association," she said, her voice clipped, airy, and projecting to an imaginary audience. "We haven't been formally introduced. You are the inhabitant of the Anderson property?" "I'm Billy, their son. Good to meet you, Anne." I extended a hand, a reflex from 1,000 business meetings in glass-walled boardrooms. I pulled it back just as quickly when I saw her eyes dart to the black grease under my fingernails and the smudge of carbon on my knuckles. She recoiled an inch, her neck stiffening as if the mere suggestion of manual labor might be a transmissible disease. "I see. Well, William, I'm sure you're busy with your mechanical hobbies, but we have very specific bylaws regarding the maintenance of vehicles in view of the street. This isn't a wrecking yard, and it certainly isn't an industrial zone." "It's just Billy, actually," I corrected mildly, leaning back against the grill of the truck. "And she's not a wreck. She's just been sitting in the garage since Dad passed. She needs a new alternator and a bit of love." Anne gave a tight, pitying smile, the kind people give when they're explaining why a dog has to be put down. She looked me up and down, performing a rapid-fire social audit. She saw the scuffed work boots I'd bought at a surplus store, the tan lines from the high-vis shirt I'd been wearing earlier to clear the overgrown brush in the back, and the absence of a luxury watch on my wrist. She checked a box on her mental list. Unskilled, likely hourly, potential squatter. "William," she said, stressing every syllable as if teaching a toddler a difficult word. "In this community, we find that professional standards start with how we present ourselves. We represent a certain tier of achievement here. And Billy, well, Billy is not a name. It's a diagnosis. It suggests a certain lack of maturity that I'm sure you'll want to grow out of if you plan on staying here. This is Oak Creek, not a caravan park." I felt the cold weight of the Ledger Nano in my pocket, tucked into the small coin slot of my cargoes. It was a small plastic drive that held more liquid wealth than Anne Sterling would likely see in 10 lifetimes. I'd spent years perfecting the art of being invisible. In the world of finance, if they see you coming, they front-run your trade. If they know you're rich, they target your life. Being Billy the tradie was the best insurance policy I'd ever bought. It weeded out the gold diggers and the sycophants before they could even get a foot in the door. "Understood, Anne," I said. My voice dropped into the calm, flat tone I used when the market was crashing and everyone else was screaming. It was the sound of someone who had already calculated the outcome. "I'll be sure to keep my hobbies in mind." "See that you do," she snapped, her eyes already drifting to my neighbor's driveway to see if their trash cans were back inside. "I'll have the welcoming committee send over the fee schedule for the driveway violations and the unapproved exterior storage of tools. This is a prestige neighborhood, William. Let's try to keep it that way. We wouldn't want the property values to suffer because of lifestyle choices." She turned on her heel, her posture so rigid, she looked like a parade ground drill sergeant in pearls. I watched her walk away, her heels clicking a rhythm of misplaced authority against the pristine pavement. She saw a deadbeat son in a dead man's house, a man too poor to afford a mechanic and too unrefined to know his own name. She had no idea she'd just declared war on a man who had the capital to buy the very ground she was walking on. The paperwork arrived less than 24 hours later. It wasn't just a single sheet. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope tucked into the doorframe like a summons. Anne clearly didn't believe in the digital age, or perhaps she just enjoyed the tactile thrill of a physical threat. I sat on the front porch with a lukewarm coffee, peeling the envelope open with a greasy thumbnail. Inside was a Notice of non-compliance printed on heavy cardstock. Violation 4.2. Commercial vehicle storage, $100 per day. Violation 7.1. Unauthorized exterior maintenance, $50 per instance. Violation 12.5. Unsightly personal property, $25 per day. I looked at the Land Cruiser. It was 28 years old, sure, but it was clean. It was an icon of engineering. To Anne, it was just a work truck. I looked at my boots, drying on the mat. They were unsightly. Most people would have panicked. Most people would have been on the phone to the HOA office pleading for a grace period. But my brain doesn't do panic. It does data. In the world of high-frequency trading, you don't get emotional when a position goes against you. You look for the arbitrage. You look for the gap between what the market thinks is happening and what is actually happening. Anne thought I was a broke tradesman living off an inheritance I couldn't afford to maintain. The arbitrage here was massive. I went inside and cleared the kitchen table. My parents' house was a time capsule of sensible choices. Floral wallpaper, solid oak furniture, and a desktop computer that belonged in a museum. I pulled my specialized laptop out of its battered, nondescript bag. It was a ruggedized ThinkPad, the kind engineers use on oil rigs, but inside it had enough processing power to run a small country's central bank. I logged into the Oak Creek Estates homeowner portal. I'd spent the last hour of the night before doing a basic scrape of their public filings. Now, it was time to go deeper. An HOA is just a corporation. It has assets, liabilities, and, most importantly, paper trails. I started with the annual budget. On paper, Oak Creek was a prestige community with a healthy reserve fund. But as I scrolled through the line items, the red flags started popping up like bad trades. Landscaping and beautification, $140,000 per annum. I frowned. I'd walked the common areas. The hedges were trimmed and the mulch was fresh, but $140,000 was double the market rate for a community this size. I traced the vendor name, Green Visions LLC. I opened a second window and pulled up the state's business registry. It took me 3 minutes to find the filing. Green Visions LLC was registered to a David Sterling. Checkmate, I whispered to the empty kitchen. David was Anne's nephew. I'd seen his face on her Facebook page while doing my initial due diligence, a frat boy type with a backwards cap and a smile that looked like it cost more than my first car. Anne was funneling homeowner dues directly into her family's pockets. It was a classic, low-level embezzlement scheme, hidden behind the diagnosis of maintaining neighborhood standards. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Marcus, my old lead developer from the London office. BTC just hit a new local high. Your cold wallet is screaming for a holiday. Why are you in the suburbs again? I looked out the window. Anne was across the street, pointing a finger at a neighbor's mailbox while scribbling on her clipboard. She looked like she was enjoying herself. She looked like she felt powerful. I'm doing some charity work, I typed back. Cleaning up a local blight. I didn't pay the fines. I didn't call a lawyer. Instead, I spent the afternoon in the backyard, intentionally leaving a pile of lumber in plain sight of the street. I wanted her to feel emboldened. I wanted her to write more tickets. In the world of finance, you let the other side build a massive, leveraged position before you pull the rug. Every ticket she wrote was more evidence of selective enforcement. Every fine she issued was another nail in her own coffin. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows over the manicured lawns, I went back to the Land Cruiser. I wasn't just fixing an alternator anymore. I was dismantling a regime. I picked up my 10mm socket and got back to work, whistling a quiet tune. Anne Sterling thought she was protecting the aesthetic of Oak Creek. She didn't realize she'd just invited a forensic accountant with $30 million and a lot of free time to perform a very painful surgery on her life. I could afford the $175 in daily fines. I could afford them for the next 1,000 years. But I had a feeling Anne couldn't afford the audit that was coming. I looked up as her blue linen suit shimmered past the end of the driveway again. She didn't look at me this time. She just smirked at her clipboard. "Keep writing, Anne," I muttered, tightening the belt. "Every word is a refund." I closed the hood with a satisfying thud. The engine turned over on the first try, a low, powerful growl that vibrated in the soles of my boots. It was the sound of a machine that knew exactly what it was doing. I was Billy, and I was about to be the most expensive diagnosis Anne Sterling ever made. The next morning, I traded the grease-stained rag for a clean flannel shirt. I kept the work boots. The ones with the reinforced steel toes and the permanent dust of a dozen DIY projects. If I was going to be a diagnosis, I might as well be a consistent one. I needed to move some liquidity. While 30 million in Bitcoin is a beautiful thing to look at on a screen, it doesn't always play nice with the traditional banking systems required for property acquisitions and corporate debt buyouts. I needed a bridge. I pulled the Land Cruiser into the parking lot of the local branch of First National. It was a sterile, glass-fronted building that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and desperation. As I hopped out of the truck, a familiar blue linen suit caught my eye. Anne was already there, leaning over the desk of a junior teller, her voice carrying that sharp, "I'd like to speak to the manager" frequency. I walked in behind her, the heavy thud of my boots sounding like a drum beat on the polished tiles. "It's a matter of community safety," Anne was saying, her clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon. "We have reason to believe the Anderson estate is precarious. We wouldn't want a foreclosure sitting like a rod at the heart of Oak Creek." The teller, a young guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, caught my eye. I gave him a small nod. Anne spun around, her eyes widening as they raked over my flannel and my faded cargoes. "William," she said, her voice dripping with mock concern, "are you here to settle your parents' affairs? Or perhaps looking for a payday loan to cover your HOA obligations?" "Just checking the weather, Anne," I said. I walked past her toward the office at the back. The door read Mr. Henderson, branch manager. Anne let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Mr. Henderson is a very busy man, William. He doesn't handle walk-in inquiries for personal accounts of your scale." She followed me, likely hoping to witness my humiliation. I didn't stop. I knocked once and walked in. Mr. Henderson was a man who lived and breathed interest rates. He looked up from a stack of mortgage applications, his eyes hidden behind thick, rimless spectacles. When he saw me, he started to stand, a reflex born from the high net worth flag that inevitably popped up on his screen every time I logged into the bank's portal. "Mr. Mill." I cut him off with a sharp, nearly imperceptible shake of my head. I didn't need the Mr. Anderson treatment yet. I needed the Billy treatment. "Hey, Greg," I said, dropping into a chair. "Just wanted to talk about the Oak Creek development debt." Anne stood in the doorway, her mouth slightly agape. "Greg, you're on a first-name basis with the manager?" She turned to Henderson, her voice rising. "Gregory, this man is a nuisance. He's currently under multiple violations in our community. I was just coming to warn you about the stability of his residency." Henderson looked at Anne, then back at me. He was a smart man. He saw the grease under my nails and the way I was lounging in the chair as if I owned the building. He also saw the look in my eyes, the cold, calculating stare of a man who could move $10 million with a thumbprint. "Mrs. Sterling," Henderson said, his voice remarkably flat, "Mr. Anderson's accounts are robust, extremely robust. In fact, if we're talking about stability, his presence in this branch is arguably the most stable thing in this zip code." Anne's face went a peculiar shade of mauve. "Robust? He drives a 20-year-old truck and dresses like a day laborer." "Appearance can be a very poor metric for value, Anne," I said, finally looking at her. "Kind of like how a beautification budget can be a very poor metric for honesty." Her eyes flickered. Just for a second, the mention of the budget hit a nerve she didn't know I could see. She pulled her shoulders back, clutching her clipboard. "I don't know what you think you're implying, but I won't be spoken to like this by a diagnosis." She turned and marched out, the heels of her shoes clicking furiously. Once she was gone, Henderson sighed and leaned back. "She's been in here 3 times this week asking about your parents' mortgage. I told her I couldn't disclose private information, but she's persistent." "What are you doing, Billy? You could live in a penthouse in Mayfair. Why are you letting a suburban HOA president haunt you?" "Because it's interesting, Greg," I said, "and because I don't like bullies. Now, tell me about the Oak Creek clubhouse loan." "Who holds the paper?" I asked. "A subsidiary of ours. We were looking at bundling it and selling it off to a debt recovery firm." I leaned forward, the Billy persona slipping away for a moment, replaced by the shark that had survived the 2017 crypto winters. "Don't bundle it. Sell it to me. Private sale, through an LLC called Diagnosis Holdings." Henderson paused. "You want to buy the debt of your own neighborhood?" "I want to be the one who decides when the bill comes due," I said. I left the bank 20 minutes later. I had a digital wire transfer pending and a legal team in the city already drafting the acquisition papers. As I pulled the Land Cruiser out of the lot, I saw Anne sitting in her white BMW, staring at me through the windshield. She looked confused, angry, and for the first time, a little bit curious. I waved a grease-stained hand at her and drove away. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was the bank. And in the world of finance, the bank always wins. The morning after the bank visit, the air in the cul-de-sac felt different. It was thicker, charged with the kind of static that precedes a market crash. I was out on the front lawn, barefoot and nursing a mug of black coffee, watching a man in a bucket hat install a high-end 4K security camera on the utility pole directly opposite my driveway. I didn't need a degree in espionage to know who had ordered the hit. Ann Sterling was no longer content with power walks. She wanted a 24-hour feed of my diagnosis. "Nice rig," I called out to the technician. "Does it have night vision? I do a lot of my best work in the dark." The guy just grunted and tightened a bracket. He was just a contractor, probably being paid by the HOA with funds that should have gone toward fixing the cracked sidewalk 3 houses down. I went inside and pulled out my phone. It was time to bring in the cavalry. I opened an encrypted group chat that hadn't seen much action since the last Bitcoin halving. "I need 3 volunteers for a deep cover operation in the suburbs. Dress code: post-apocalyptic contractor. Vehicle requirements: the rustier, the better. Drinks and data on me." The replies were instantaneous. J, ex-Googler, worth $80 million. I've been waiting for a reason to drive my 74 El Camino. I'm in. S, quant genius, worth $40 million. I have a high-vis vest from a construction site I bought in 21. See you at noon. K, cybersecurity specialist, worth unknown. I'll bring the signal jammers, just in case. By 1 p.m., the quiet, manicured piece of Oak Creek Estates was systematically dismantled. Jax pulled up first, his El Camino backfiring with a sound like a gunshot that brought 3 neighbors to their windows. Then came Sarah in a dented Ford F-150 that smelled of diesel and bad decisions. Finally, Kevin arrived in a nondescript white van that looked like it belonged on a most wanted list, but was packed with more computing power than the local police station. We sat on the front porch, 4 of the wealthiest people under 40 in the state, looking like a group of day laborers waiting for a foreman who was never coming. I'd set out a cooler of cheap soda and a few bags of generic crisps. "So?" Jack said, leaning back and propping his mud-caked boots up on my parents' porch railing. "Which one is she?" "Wait for it," I whispered. 5 minutes later, Anne's white BMW rounded the corner. She slowed to a crawl as she passed the house. I watched her eyes widen as she took in the scene. 4 tradies lounging on a porch, surrounded by work vehicles that looked like they'd been salvaged from a swamp. I saw her phone come up. She was filming. "Action," I muttered. "So, Billy," Sarah said, her voice projecting perfectly toward the street, "if we move the liquidity into the cold storage by the next block height, does that mitigate the slippage on the decentralized exchange?" "Only if the gas fees don't spike," I replied, loud and clear. "But the protocol upgrade should handle the throughput." To anyone with a brain, we were talking about high-level blockchain architecture. To Anne, peering through a tinted windshield, we sounded like we were discussing a massive, illegal drug manufacturing operation. Words like liquidity, blocks, gas, and exchange were being filtered through her bias and coming out as contraband. She pulled over 3 houses down and stayed there, her thumbs flying across her phone screen. "She's calling the board," Kevin whispered, tapping a tablet hidden inside a hollowed-out toolbox. "And the local precinct, non-emergency line, reporting suspicious gatherings and potential unlicensed commercial activity." "Perfect," I said, taking a slow sip of my soda. "Let her build the file. The more she documents her own harassment, the less work my lawyers have to do later." We spent the afternoon working. We moved a pile of scrap wood from the left side of the yard to the right. We took turns revving Jax's engine. We even stood around a blueprint of the neighborhood's drainage system, pointing and shaking our heads solemnly, while Anne watched from behind her curtains 2 doors down. Around 4 p.m., a patrol car cruised by. The officer looked at us, saw 4 people sitting on a porch drinking lemonade, and gave a bored wave. We weren't breaking any laws. We were just being unsightly. As my friends prepared to leave, Jax leaned over and hugged me, intentionally making sure Anne saw the squalor of our camaraderie. "Same time tomorrow, William?" he shouted. "You bet, Jax. We'll get that shipment sorted." Anne slammed her front door so hard I heard the glass rattle from 50 yards away. I walked back into the house and checked my email. There was a notification from the bank. The acquisition of the Oak Creek Clubhouse loan was complete. I was now officially the HOA's landlord. I looked up at the security camera on the pole. I raised my coffee mug in a silent toast. Your move, Anne. Make it a big one. The wellness check happened at 7 a.m. I was in the kitchen weighing out coffee beans with a precision scale when the heavy thud of a fist hit the front door. It wasn't the frantic, bird-like tapping of Ann Sterling. This was the sound of someone with a badge and a quota. I opened the door to find two local officers. Behind them, hovering on the sidewalk like a nervous ghost in a silk robe, was Anne. She had her arms crossed, her eyes darting between me and the suspicious white van Kevin had left parked in my driveway overnight. "Mr. Anderson?" the older officer asked. He looked tired. "We received a report of suspicious activity, possible occupancy issues and concerns about the welfare of the residents." "I'm fine, officer," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Just making coffee. Would you like a cup?" It's a washed Ethiopian Yirgacheffe. Notes of jasmine and bergamot. The officer blinked. It wasn't the response he expected from a diagnosis. The caller mentioned a high volume of transient individuals and possible illegal industrial operations, he said, glancing back at Anne. "I had some friends over to help move my parents' old furniture," I said clearly, making sure my voice carried. "Is there a law against having friends, or does that only apply to people who don't wear linen suits?" Anne stepped forward, her face pinched. "Officer, look at that van. Look at the state of this driveway. There are tools everywhere. It's a hazard. It's a private property, Mrs. Sterling," the officer interrupted, sighing. He turned back to me. "Sorry for the disturbance, Mr. Anderson. Have a good morning." They left. Anne stayed on the sidewalk for a long minute, staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. She didn't say a word. She just turned and marched back to her house. 2 hours later, a courier arrived. This wasn't a standard HOA envelope. This was a thick, legal-sized packet from Sterling, Pence and Associates, her husband's law firm. It was a formal cease and desist and notice of intent to foreclose. I sat at the kitchen table and read through the 15 pages of legal fluff. It was a masterpiece of creative writing. They were accusing me of running an unlicensed commercial workshop, creating a public nuisance, violating the character and harmony clause of the CC&Rs, accumulating $4,200 in unpaid fines, including emergency surcharges for the police visit she had triggered. The kicker was at the end. Failure to remit the full balance and remove all commercial vehicles within 48 hours will result in the association placing a lien on the property and initiating judicial foreclosure. She wasn't just trying to fine me anymore. She was trying to take my parents' house. I felt a cold, familiar spark in my chest. This was the feeling I used to get when I saw a massive cell wall on an exchange. The moment you realize the person on the other side has overextended their position and left their throat exposed. I picked up my phone and called my lead counsel in the city, a man who charged $1,200 an hour to make problems disappear. "Hey, Sarah, I just got a threat from a suburban HOA. They're trying to foreclose on a $30 million asset over a 1998 Land Cruiser." I heard her laugh on the other end. "Do you want me to crush them, or are you playing with your food?" "I'm playing," I said, "but I need some specific intel. I just bought the debt on their clubhouse through Diagnosis Holdings. I want you to look at the Sterling name in their vendor list. Cross-reference it with the HOA's tax-exempt status. I think the president is using the association as a personal piggy bank." "On it?" she said. "Anything else?" "Yeah. Check the local zoning laws. If this is a prestige neighborhood, I want to know exactly what the minimum requirement is for a community-led environmental project. I have an idea for the vacant lot next to Anne's house." I hung up and looked out the window. Anne was out there again, pointing at my grass with her clipboard. She thought she had me trapped in a corner. She thought the cease and desist was the final blow. She didn't realize that in my world, a cease and desist is just an invitation to negotiate from a position of absolute strength. I walked out to the driveway, picked up a wrench, and intentionally dropped it. The metallic clang echoed through the quiet street. Anne flinched. 48 hours, William," she shouted. "I heard you the first time, Anne," I called back, smiling. "I'm just diagnosing the situation." I went back inside and opened my laptop. I had 48 hours to turn her prestige neighborhood into a financial crime scene. I've never been better at math than when I'm annoyed. The Oak Creek Spring Social was held at the community clubhouse, a sprawling, faux Tuscan monstrosity that I now technically own the mortgage for. I decided to lean into the diagnosis. I spent the afternoon helping Jack swap the suspension on his El Camino, ensuring my forearms were properly streaked with grease. I didn't shower. I just wiped my face with a damp rag, threw on a high-vis vest over a faded black t-shirt, and kept my steel-capped boots on. "You look like a public works project," Jack said, grinning as he adjusted his own flannel shirt. "Ready? Let's go make some friends," I said. We arrived in the El Camino, the engine rumbling like a low-altitude bomber. The parking lot was a sea of Teslas, Porsches, and late-model Range Rovers. We parked diagonally across two spots near the entrance, mostly because Jax's turning circle was roughly that of a small moon. As we walked in, the conversation in the foyer didn't just stop, it died. The clubhouse smelled of expensive catering and desperation. Anne was at the center of the room, wearing a dress that cost more than a mid-range sedan, holding a glass of sparkling water like a scepter. She saw us, and I watched her nostrils flare. "William," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a serrated knife. "This is a private community function for residents and their invited guests." "I'm a resident, Anne," I said, grabbing a tiny quiche from a passing tray and popping it into my mouth. "And these are my associates. You remember Jax, Sarah, and Kevin?" My associates looked like a group of people who had just finished digging a very deep trench. Sarah had a smudge of dirt on her cheek, and Kevin was carrying a ruggedized tablet that looked suspiciously like a bomb trigger to the uninitiated. "This is an insult," Anne hissed, stepping closer. "You show up here looking like this? After the notice you received? You have 24 hours left, William. I'd suggest you spend them packing, not eating our shrimp." "Actually, Anne," Sarah said, her voice smooth and dangerous, "we were just admiring the crown molding. It looks a bit budget for a clubhouse that supposedly cost 1.2 million to renovate." Anne stiffened. "I don't know who you think you are, but the aesthetics of this building were curated by professionals." "Professionals like Green Visions LLC?" I asked mildly. The color drained from Anne's face so fast it was almost impressive. She tried to recover, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped her glass. "The landscaping firm? What does that have to do with anything?" "Just noticed their truck out front," I lied. I hadn't seen one, but I knew I'd hit a nerve. Funny how they charge 4 times the market rate for mulch. Must be some very special wood chips. A few neighbors, the ones who actually paid attention to their monthly dues, started to drift closer. I saw a man in a golf shirt, a guy named Miller, narrow his eyes. "4 times? I thought we got a bulk discount." "Ask the president," I said, waving a hand toward Anne. "She's the one with the diagnosis for the neighborhood's health." Anne's eyes were darting around the room now. She was losing the floor. She did the only thing a bully knows how to do. She escalated. "William is clearly unwell," she announced to the room, her voice shaking with forced pity. "He's a squatter in his parents' home, unable to afford the basic upkeep, trying to distract us with conspiracy theories. He won't be here next week. The board has already moved for judicial foreclosure." I took a slow sip of a soda I'd snagged from the bar. The room was watching me, waiting for the unemployed guy to break. "You know, Anne," I said, the quiet, cold tone of the trade floor returning to my voice. "In finance, we call what you're doing naked shorting. You're betting against an asset you don't actually control. And when the margin call comes, it hurts." "I don't speak gibberish," she snapped. "Leave. Now, or I'll have security escort you out." "No need," I said, checking my watch. It was a $20 Casio, but the time on it was exactly what I needed. "We're done here anyway. I just wanted to make sure everyone was invited to the board meeting tomorrow night. It's going to be very educational." I turned to Jax and the others. "Come on, guys. Let's go. I've got some diagnosing to do." As we walked out, I heard the murmurs start behind us. The seeds of doubt had been planted. Anne was still standing there, her face a mask of fury, but for the first time, I saw the flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. She knew I knew. She just didn't know how much. Outside by the El Camino, Kevin tapped his tablet. I just pushed the forensic folders to every registered email in the HOA database. Subject line: Oak Creek Financial Audit. Urgent. Good, I said, hopping into the truck. Let them read it over breakfast. Billy? Jax asked as he fired up the engine. What happens to the clubhouse mortgage tomorrow? I looked back at the Prestige building, glowing under its expensive, over-budget floodlights. Tomorrow, I said, the bank comes home. The morning after the mixer, the cul-de-sac was eerily quiet. There were no power walks, no clicking heels, no Ann Sterling pointing at mailboxes. The digital bomb Kevin had dropped at midnight had done its work. I sat on my porch, once again in my grease-stained cargos, watching the neighborhood wake up. Usually, the residents of Oak Creek avoided eye contact with the tradie at number 42. But today was different. Every few minutes, a curtain would twitch. A garage door would open halfway, and a neighbor would linger by their bin, staring at me with a mix of confusion and dawning realization. They had all spent their breakfast reading the Sterling files. I'd laid it out for them in a simple, color-coded PDF. The kickbacks to Green Visions LLC. The consulting fees paid to Ann's husband's law firm. The fact that the reserve fund, the money they'd all paid for the future of their homes, was being treated like a revolving credit line for the Sterling family's lifestyle. Around 10 a.m., a black SUV pulled up. It was Miller, the guy in the golf shirt from the night before. He didn't stay in his car. He walked right up my driveway. Billy, he said, holding his phone out. This data, the spreadsheet on page 4, the one showing the roof repair markup. Is this real? I'm a finance guy, Mr. Miller, I said, leaning back against a porch pillar. I don't do fiction. Those are the bank's own internal audit records of the HOA's disbursements. I just cross-referenced them with the public business registrations. You said you were a finance guy. He narrowed his eyes, looking at my boots. Then why all this? I like fixing things, I said simply. And I don't like being told my name is a diagnosis by a woman who's stealing 40 grand a year from her neighbors. He looked at the house, then back at me. A slow nod. Most of us are meeting at the clubhouse an hour before the board meeting. We want to know what else you found. I'll be there, I said. Bring your copies of the bylaws. The ones about member-led audits. Section 9.2. As he drove away, I saw Ann's BMW pull out of her driveway 2 doors down. She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She was heading to her husband's office. She was in damage control mode. I went back inside and called Sarah. How's the lot next to Ann's? Closing finalized an hour ago, she said, sounding giddy. You are now the proud owner of the 1/4 acre of weeds and dirt directly adjacent to the Sterling residence. What's the plan? A neon sign? A pig farm? Nothing so crude, I said. I'm going to build a community environmental education center. It's a protected category under the local zoning. I've already got a delivery of 6 industrial-sized compost bins and 4 portable toilets arriving this afternoon. For the volunteers, of course. You're a monster, she laughed. I'm a diagnosis, Sarah. Don't forget, by 2 p.m., the first flatbed truck arrived. It rumbled past Ann's house and parked on the vacant lot. I stood on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, directing the driver. Yeah, just drop the porta potties right there, I said, pointing to the spot exactly 3 feet from Ann's pristine white picket fence. The compost goes behind them. We want the smell to be authentic. The neighborhood was buzzing now. People were coming out of their houses to watch. I saw the vice president of the HOA, a nervous-looking man named Arthur, scurrying toward me. William, what is this? You can't put facilities here. It's a nonprofit environmental project, Arthur, I said, not looking up from my clipboard. Completely legal. I checked the zoning myself. Actually, since I own the land now, I'm thinking of making it a 24-hour drop-off point for organic waste. Very green, very prestige, but the smell, the aesthetics. Character and harmony, Arthur, I said, finally looking at him. That's what Anne always says, right? I think there's nothing more harmonious than returning nutrients to the soil. I saw Anne's BMW return. She stopped at the edge of the lot, staring at the row of plastic toilets and the mountain of mulch being dumped next to her rose bushes. She didn't get out of the car. She just sat there, her face a mask of frozen horror. I waved at her. She didn't wave back. The board meeting was 6 hours away. The audit was in their inboxes. The toilets were on her lawn. And the bank, my bank, was ready to call the loan. I went back to my porch and picked up a wrench. I had one more thing to fix on the Land Cruiser before the main event. I decided to stay in the diagnosis. I didn't shower, and I didn't change. I just wiped the fresh grease from the compost bin delivery off my palms and kept my high-vis vest on. There is a specific kind of power in being the person everyone looks down on, right up until you're the one holding the scissors to their safety net. The clubhouse was packed. This wasn't the polite, wine-sipping crowd from the mixer. This was a mob. People were clutching the printed-out audit sheets like they were evidence at a murder trial. The air was thick with the scent of cheap clubhouse coffee and a very expensive kind of suburban rage. Anne was already at the head table. She had traded the blue linen for a black power suit, her hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. Her husband, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of a block of mahogany and arrogance, sat next to her. He was the legal counsel for the board, a clear conflict of interest I'd highlighted on page 12 of my report. I walked in late, the steel toes of my boots echoing on the hardwood. I took a seat right in the front row. "The meeting will come to order," Anne snapped, hitting the gavel with a force that made the water glasses jump. "First item on the agenda, the immediate judicial foreclosure of the Anderson property due to—" Actually, Anne Miller, the golf shirt neighbor, stood up from the back. "I'd like to move to suspend the agenda and address the Sterling files first." "That is a private, unverified document," Anne's husband barked, "and the distribution of it is a violation of the association's privacy bylaws. We will be seeking damages." "Seek away," I said, leaning back and crossing my muddy boots. "But you might want to check whose name is on the clubhouse mortgage before you start writing checks you can't cash." Anne's eyes snapped to mine. "What are you talking about, William?" "I told you, Anne. My name is Billy, and William is the name on the debt acquisition papers that hit the county clerk's office at 4:30 this afternoon." I pulled my ruggedized laptop from my tool bag and plugged it into the projector meant for landscape presentations. The screen flickered to life, showing a digital copy of the deed of trust for the building we were sitting in. "This clubhouse was built on a $1.2 million construction loan," I told the room. I wasn't shouting. I was using my boardroom voice, the one that makes people stop breathing. "The interest-only period ends in 72 hours. The principal jump is $300,000. The HOA has exactly $12,000 in its reserve fund because the rest went to Green Visions LLC for mulch consulting." A gasp went through the room. Anne's husband stood up, his face turning a deep, dangerous purple. "This is a fabrication. We have a line of credit with First National." "You had a line of credit," I corrected. "I bought the underlying debt. I am the creditor now, and as of 5 minutes ago, I've issued a notice of default based on the blatant mismanagement of funds revealed in the audit." "You can't do that," Anne screamed, her composure finally evaporating. She looked at her neighbors, her subjects, but no one was looking back with anything but contempt. "He's a nobody. He's a mechanic. He's a diagnosis." "I'm a $30 million diagnosis, Anne," I said, standing up. I walked toward the head table. "I spent my 20s in the pits of the Bitcoin markets and the hedge fund trenches. I've liquidated companies 10 times the size of this HOA before my morning coffee." I looked at the neighbors. "I don't want your houses. I don't even want your money. I just want a neighborhood where a man can fix his dad's truck without being harassed by a bored thief in a linen suit." I turned back to Anne. "The bank is calling the loan, unless, of course, the board undergoes an immediate, total restructuring, starting with the resignation of the president and a full repayment of the beautification kickbacks." The room erupted. "Resign!" Miller shouted. The chant took hold. Anne looked at her husband, but he was already looking at his briefcase, likely calculating how to distance himself from the fraud. She looked at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "You ruined it," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You ruined the aesthetic." "Aesthetics are skin deep, Anne," I said, leaning over the table. "Integrity goes all the way to the bone. You're done." I picked up the gavel. It felt lighter than I expected. I handed it to Miller. "I believe you have some new business to attend to," I said. I walked out of the clubhouse and into the cool night air. Across the street, the porta-potties on the vacant lot stood in a neat, silent row. I took a deep breath of the night air. It smelled like mulch, grease, and justice. I went home, sat on my porch, and checked my cold wallet. The markets were up, my neighbors were free, and for the first time in years, the Anderson property felt like home. The fallout was swift, clinical, and remarkably public. In the world of high finance, a margin call is just a polite way of saying your time is up and the house is coming to collect. For Ann Sterling, that call didn't come as a digital notification on a Bloomberg terminal. It arrived in the form of a forensic accounting team in sensible shoes and a dozen angry neighbors holding subpoenas like torches. I spent the next morning on my porch, nursing a coffee that actually tasted good for the first time in weeks. I wasn't scrolling through charts or checking the latest block height. I was watching the reverse parade of a collapsing empire. The first casualty was the silver Mercedes, the husband's partnership car. It was loaded onto a flatbed by 9 a.m. after the new interim HOA board, led by Miller, filed an emergency injunction to freeze the Sterling's assets pending a full recovery of the beautification funds. I watched the driver struggle with the low clearance of the curb, the screech of expensive metal on concrete echoing through the quiet street. Usually that sound would have brought Anne out screaming about property damage. Today, her front door stayed shut. Then came the for sale sign. It wasn't one of those elegant, custom-carved wooden signs Anne had mandated for the rest of us. It was a standard, flimsy plastic distress sale board, hammered into her pristine, chemically treated lawn by a realtor who looked like he'd just been told he was selling a haunted house. The stake hit a hidden irrigation line, sending a pathetic little spurt of water into the air. Nobody bothered to fix it. By noon, the moving trucks arrived. They were battered, generic rentals. No white glove service for a woman whose credit score was currently undergoing a controlled demolition. I was sitting on my front steps, deep into the satisfying task of cleaning the grease from a set of spark plugs, when Anne finally emerged. She wasn't wearing the blue linen suit today. She was wearing an oversized gray tracksuit that looked like it belonged to a different person, her hair hidden under a baseball cap. Large sunglasses covered half her face, but they couldn't hide the way her jaw was set in a permanent, bitter line. She was clutching a single designer handbag like it contained the last of her dignity. She stopped at the very edge of my driveway, right where the Community Environmental Education Center, my row of spite toilets, stood as a silent, plastic monument to her defeat. The smell of the compost was particularly robust in the midday heat. "You think you've won?" she said, her voice thin and raspy, stripped of its airy authority. "But you've just turned this place into a slum, William. You and your filth." I didn't look up from the spark plug. I just kept scrubbing with the wire brush. "The toilets are being picked up at 2, Anne. My point's been made. I'm donating the lot to the city as a permanent bird sanctuary. No buildings, no fences, just trees and peace. It'll do wonders for the neighborhood's blood pressure." "You're a monster," she spat, her voice trembling. "A rich man playing at being poor just so he can hurt people. You sat there in your dirt and your grease, laughing at us while you planned this." I finally looked up. I didn't feel the surge of triumph I'd expected. I just felt a profound sense of relief that the noise was finally stopping. "I didn't play at being poor, Anne. I just didn't play at being important. There's a difference. You targeted me because you thought I was a victim who couldn't fight back. You didn't hate my clothes. You hated that you couldn't find the price tag on my soul. You couldn't control me, so you tried to erase me." She stared at me, and for a second, the sunglasses slipped. I saw the eyes of a woman who realized she had been the architect of her own diagnosis. She had spent so much time policing the aesthetic that she'd forgotten to build a foundation. "This was a prestige neighborhood," she whispered, looking at the distress sale sign. "It still is," I said. "It's just got a different definition of value now." She didn't have a retort left. There was no gavel to bang, no board to command, and no bank manager who would take her calls. She just turned and climbed into a waiting Uber, leaving her cardboard-boxed life behind. The driver didn't even get out to help her with her bag. 10 minutes after she disappeared around the corner, Miller pulled up in his golf shirt. He looked at the vacant lot, then at the Land Cruiser, then finally at me. He looked like a man who had just had a very heavy backpack taken off his shoulders. "The board met this morning in the clubhouse," he said, leaning out his window. "First order of business was a unanimous vote. We've officially cleared every single violation on your property, retroactively. The commercial vehicle rule has been amended to any vehicle in safe working order, and we're interviewing new management companies, ones that don't have a Sterling on the secret payroll. Sounds like the neighborhood is finally in recovery, I said, tossing the clean spark plug into my tool tray. Listen, Billy, about that clubhouse mortgage, the 1.2 million, you really going to let us pay it back at 0%? 0%, Miller, I confirmed. As long as you lot leave me and my mechanical hobbies in peace, I'm the best bank you'll ever have. But if I see another clipboard on my lawn, I might have to raise the rates. He laughed, a real belly-shaking sound. Fair enough. See you around, Billy. I walked over to the Land Cruiser and hopped into the driver's seat. I turned the key. The engine didn't just start. It purred with a low, powerful growl that vibrated through the soles of my boots. I shifted into gear and backed out of the driveway, the tires crunching over the gravel. For the first time in months, I wasn't checking my mirrors for a blue suit. I wasn't calculating the cost of a fine. I was just a guy in a truck heading to the hardware store because I felt like it. As I drove past Anne's empty house, I saw a single white rose petal fall from her prize bushes, the ones that had cost the neighborhood $10,000 in consulting fees, onto the cracked sidewalk. I didn't stop to pick it up. I had a bird sanctuary to plan and a life to live. The diagnosis was finally clear. I was home. I realized I'd made a tactical error when I saw the first drone. It wasn't a high-end, professional rig. It was a hobbyist toy, buzzing like a giant mosquito over my backyard while I was trying to eat a sandwich. The secret millionaire of Oak Creek story had hit the local Facebook groups at midnight, and by noon, it had been picked up by a regional news human interest crawler. The narrative was too perfect for the internet to ignore. Traded down tradie topples HOA tyrant. I sat at my kitchen table, watching the drone's camera lens tilt toward my windows. To the world, this was a feel-good victory. To me, it was a security breach. $30 million is a lot of money, but it's also a lot of gravity. It pulls in people who want a handout, people who want a story, and worst of all, people who want to connect. My phone buzzed with a notification from Jax. You're trending on Reddit, Billy. The diagnosis has gone viral. You've got people asking for your crypto wallet address in the comments. Pack your bags. He was right. The anonymity that had been my armor was now a neon sign. I couldn't be Billy the tradie if everyone knew I was William the Whale. The neighbors who used to look away now waved with a desperate, wide-eyed intensity that made my skin crawl. They didn't see a guy fixing a truck anymore. They saw a walking, breathing bailout. I spent the afternoon on the dark web and on encrypted calls with my legal team. By 4 p.m., I had the framework of my disappearance ready. Step 1. The property. I didn't sell the house. That would leave a paper trail. Instead, I transferred the Anderson property into a blind trust called the Silver Birch Foundation. Its public mission was to maintain the bird sanctuary I'd promised the city. To the neighbors, it would look like I'd just handed the keys to a nonprofit. Step 2. The assets. I moved my primary cold storage wallets into a multi-sig vault across 3 different jurisdictions. I set up a revolving credit line against a fraction of my holdings, accessible through a nondescript debit card under a shell company. Step 3. The exit. Around 9 p.m., a nondescript white box truck, very similar to the one Kevin had used, pulled into my driveway. 2 guys in movers' overalls started loading crates. They weren't moving furniture. They were moving my servers, my tools, and the few personal items of my parents that I couldn't bear to leave behind. Miller walked over from across the street, his hands in his pockets. He looked at the truck, then at me. Leaving us so soon, Billy? We just got the new bylaws printed. The birds need their space, Miller, I said, leaning against the side of the truck. And I've got a project out west that needs my attention. A lot of undiagnosed engines out there. He looked at me for a long time. I think he knew. He'd seen the drones too. You're a weird guy, Billy, but you're the best thing that ever happened to this cul-de-sac. Thanks for the 0%. Don't make me regret it, I said, shaking his hand. By midnight, the house was empty. I'd left the Land Cruiser in the garage. It was too recognizable now. Instead, I climbed into the cab of the box truck. I looked at the house in the rearview mirror. The for sale sign on Anne's lawn was gone. She was truly a memory now. My parents' home looked quiet, dignified, and finally at peace. I'd set up a permanent landscaping contract to keep the lawn at the exact height Anne had hated. Long enough to be lush, short enough to be legal. Where to, boss? The driver asked. Head toward the coast, I said. I know a town where nobody cares about Bitcoin, and everyone drives a truck older than I am. As we pulled out of Oak Creek, I took my phone out. I looked at the diagnosis thread on my screen, Then I tapped the factory reset button. The screen went black, reflecting only the passing streetlights. I wasn't Billy the tradie anymore. I wasn't William the millionaire. I was just a ghost in a white van, heading toward a new horizon where the only aesthetic that mattered was the one I chose for myself. I closed my eyes and listened to the hum of the road. I was finally invisible again. And in my world, that was the ultimate luxury. 6 months later, the air tasted of salt and diesel rather than freshly cut mulch and suburban spite. I was living in a town called Port Silas, a place where the fog rolled in so thick you could hide a fleet of ships in it, let alone one man with a complicated bank balance. I'd bought a dilapidated boatyard on the edge of the marina. It was a beautiful mess of rusted winches, rotting timber, and a workshop that leaked when the wind blew from the east. To the locals, I was just Liam, a quiet bloke from down south who'd bought a money pit and spent his days covered in marine grease and fiberglass dust. It was perfect. I was currently working on a 1970s trawler engine, a massive hunk of iron that required more brute force than finesse. I was wearing a faded navy coverall and a beanie pulled low over my ears. My hands were back to their natural state, stained, calloused, and useful. The bell above the shop door rang, a rusty old thing I'd salvaged from a wreck. I didn't look up. Be with you in a minute. The manifold's being stubborn. No rush, Liam. I just wanted to drop off the invoice for the slipway repairs. I wiped my hands and turned around. Standing there was the local harbor master, a woman named Bev who wore high V's like a second skin and took no nonsense from anyone. She looked at the engine, then at me. "You're a wizard with those old blocks," she said, leaning against the workbench. "But you know, the town council's been talking. They're worried about the visual impact of your scrap pile out front." I felt a familiar, cold prickle at the back of my neck. My mind flashed to Anne Sterling, her blue linen suit, and her clipboard of doom. I looked Bev in the eye, searching for that glint of predatory elitism. "Visual impact?" I asked, my voice flat. "It's a boatyard, Bev. We fix things. Things that are broken usually look like scrap for a while." "I know that," she said, holding up a hand. "And I told him to stuff it. But there's a new bloke on the council. Real modernizer type. Moved here from the city last year. Says Port Silas needs to pivot toward luxury tourism. He wants to implement a new zoning code for the waterfront, starting with aesthetic compliance for industrial sites." I let out a slow, quiet breath. I'd moved 1,500 miles, changed my name, and reset my life, only to find another Anne lurking in the coastal mist. "What's his name?" I asked. "Arthur Pence," she said. "Smart guy. Lawyer, I think. His wife's real active in the local Beautify Silas committee." The name hit me like a physical blow. Pence. As in Sterling. Pence and Associates. I walked over to the window and looked out at the marina. A white SUV was parked near the pier, a brand new model, perfectly polished, looking entirely out of place among the rusted fish scales and salt-cracked pavement. A man in a tailored puffer vest stood next to it, taking photos of my boatyard with a tablet. He didn't see me watching him. He was too busy documenting my violations. "He's been asking about your lease," Bev continued, oblivious to the storm brewing behind my eyes. "Wanted to know if you were financially stable enough to maintain a primary waterfront position." I looked back at the trawler engine. I had $30 million tucked away in a digital fortress. I could buy the entire marina. I could buy the town council. I could buy Arthur Pence's house and turn it into a public fish gutting station. But then I remembered the drones in Oak Creek, the viral threads, the loss of the only thing wealth couldn't buy back: peace. "Thanks for the heads up, Bev," I said, picking up my wrench. "I'll keep it in mind." "Don't let him get under your skin, Liam. He's just a suit." "I'm not worried," I said. "I've dealt with suits before. They usually have a very predictable diagnosis." Once she was gone, I sat on an upturned crate and pulled out a burner phone. I hadn't touched my main account in 6 months. I'd been living off the modest cash flow from the boatyard. It felt good. It felt real. But Arthur Pence was a ghost from a past I hadn't quite buried deep enough. He was the husband who had stood by Anne in the clubhouse, the legal brain that had tried to steal my parents' house. If he was here, it wasn't a coincidence. He was looking for a fresh start, just like me. The difference was, he was still a predator, and he was trying to hunt in my new backyard. I tapped a few keys on the phone, opening a secure browser. I didn't look for my own balance. I looked for him. Within 10 minutes, I had his new firm's registration, his mortgage details for his coastal cottage, and the minutes from the last council meeting. He was over-leveraged. He'd used the last of his non-frozen assets to buy his way into Port Silas, betting everything on a development project that would turn the marina into a high-end resort. He needed my boatyard gone to make the project work. I leaned back against the cold iron of the engine block. I could run again. I could pack my tools, sell the lease, and disappear further north. Or I could do what I did best. I could provide a second opinion. I stayed in the shadows of the workshop, watching Arthur Pence through the salt-crusted glass. He was pointing his tablet at my scrap pile with the same clinical disdain Anne had used on my parents' lawn. He hadn't changed. He just swapped the linen for a puffer vest and the cul-de-sac for a coastline. I had a choice. I could be a ghost, or I could be a reckoning. I walked out of the shop, the heavy sliding door groaning on its tracks. The salt air hit me, cold and sharp. I didn't wipe the grease off my face. I didn't take off the beanie. I just walked toward the white SUV with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who owned every grain of sand under his boots. Pence didn't look up until I was 5 feet away. "This is private property, Liam, isn't it?" he said, his voice carrying that familiar, practiced condescension. He didn't recognize me. To him, I was just another Liam, a faceless variable in his development plan. "It's a boatyard, Arthur," I said. He froze. The tablet stayed midair. He squinted, trying to place the voice, trying to find the man beneath the grime and the coastal grit. "Do I know you?" "You knew my parents. You tried to foreclose on their house over a Land Cruiser. Remember? Billy is a diagnosis?" The color didn't just drain from his face, it evaporated. He took a half step back, his heel hitting the tire of his overpriced car. "Anderson? William Anderson?" "Billy?" I corrected. "I told you that in the clubhouse. You really shouldn't have moved to a town with a public registry, Arthur. It made finding your new resort permits very easy." "Look, that was Anne," he stammered, his hand shaking as he lowered the tablet. We're separated. I came here for a fresh start. I'm just trying to improve the local economy." "By squeezing out the locals? By beautifying people out of their livelihoods?" I stepped closer. "I bought the debt on your development project this morning, Arthur, the Silas Sands Resort. You used a secondary lender in the city. They were happy to sell. They didn't like your risk profile." You bought the loan?" He looked around the harbor as if looking for a way out. "With what?" "You're a mechanic." "I'm a guy who knows when an asset is undervalued," I said. "And right now, your presence in Port Silas is at an all-time low. I'm calling the principal. Misrepresentation of environmental impact on the permit applications. I've already sent the real data to the council." Arthur looked at the marina, at the boats, at the life he'd tried to build on a foundation of lies. He knew the game was over. I wasn't just a tradie anymore. I was the sea, and I was pulling him under. "What do you want?" he whispered. "Pack the SUV, Arthur. Leave Bev and the boatyard alone. Go find a city that doesn't have an HOA. Because if I see you in this zip code tomorrow, I won't just call the loan, I'll audit your soul." He didn't argue. He didn't cite bylaws. He got into his car and drove away, the tires kicking up salt and gravel that pinged against the bins. I stood there for a long time, watching the dust settle. Bev walked up behind me, wiping her hands on a rag. "He looked like he'd seen a ghost, Liam." "What'd you say to him?" "Just gave him a second opinion," I said. "I don't think he liked the diagnosis." I went back into the workshop. I picked up my wrench and returned to the trawler engine. It was a good engine. Honest, powerful, and meant to last. Just like the Land Cruiser. I wasn't invisible anymore. Not to everyone. But as the fog rolled in over Port Silas, I realized I didn't need to be. I just needed to be Billy. And Billy was finally, truly at peace. I turned the bolt, felt the metal give, and smiled. The engine was fixed. And so was I. And that's Billy's story. Once again, thank you for sticking around. If you enjoyed the story, consider subscribing. It's the best way to help a small channel like this get noticed by the algorithm. And let me know in the comments below what you would have done if you were in Billy's situation. See you in the next one.